I'm like, okay, first of all, just please confirm, am I adopted? Or have all these people gone now? All our birth fathers are alleged birth fathers, and then most of the time we grow up, we start seeing, do we look like him? Yep, I guess we look like him. I guess he's really my pop. One of the first things she said when she looked at me is, oh my God, you look just like him.
Fred is a late discovery adoptee. He didn't find out he was adopted until he was 41 and his adoptive parents were already deceased. Amid the confusion of this event, he quickly decided he needed to know where he did come from. The theme of secrets continued when he met his birth mother, and she preferred the relationship remain private. Fred has spent a lot of time reflecting on his life, adoption, and relationships that came with reunion. He wrote a book that details his journey from discovery to acceptance called Forbidden Roots. Here's my interview with Fred.
Usually I start off asking when and where you were adopted, but I'm going to ask you how old you were when you found out you were adopted, and how did you find out you were adopted?
I found out I was adopted when I was 41 years old. It was the year 2000. I was at a large family gathering. Both my parents had actually passed away already. And at that time, I was married. I had 3 young children. They varied in ages, roughly, I think, 6 through 2. And we were at just basically a twin uncle's birthday party. And an elderly aunt made a slip of the tongue, actually to my wife at the time originally. And then later I came back to the table and she had indicated that this woman over there indicated that she's known me since the day they adopted me. And I was shocked. I didn't know what to think about it. I went and I found her and talked to her about it. And sure enough, she figured out very soon that I didn't know. I think she assumed I knew at that point. And when she figured that out, she became embarrassed. And word started spreading through the gathering. There was about 200 people there, maybe 250. I cornered a couple of other relatives that I felt were maybe a little more reliable, and they confirmed. And that started me on my journey. My world had basically turned upside down. There were a lot of, I'd say, personal identification issues that it raised. A lot of it made sense. All of a sudden, things started to fall into place. It made sense. And then at the same time, I'm going to say none of it made sense. It just seemed like I was in a surreal dream that I didn't know how to get out of.
Did you have similarities with your adoptive family, so you never really questioned that?
Well, I was, as you talk about adoptees, I was the same race. Where I'm white, adoptive parents were white. So I wasn't an international adoptee. There wasn't anything glaringly obvious about it. Now, at the same time, I'm going to say both my parents have a strong Eastern European, not too long off the boat family history. My father was actually a first generation, 100% Romanian. Both his parents came from Romania. And my mother was about 2 or 3 generations back, basically of a Hungarian/Polish origin. So when you look at them, they both look very strongly Eastern European. They're a little smaller in stature than I am. They also had darker features. Now, my dad had blue eyes, which I have blue eyes. I was taller, bigger, thicker, blonde, red. That's how I look. And even when I asked my mother when I was younger at one point, because as you looked at me growing up, in retrospect, it looked like something was off.
Yeah.
The clues were there, but I didn't pick up on them at the time. And one time I did kind of probe a little bit with her. I said, where does my blonde hair come from? And she just said, oh, your father was lighter when he was young. So I think they were trying to backpedal at that point and keep it where it was at. So.
Were you an only child, or did you have any siblings?
No, I was an only child. I grew up as an only child. I'd say for myself that, it was a little harder. Obviously, there were interesting family dynamics that were going on at the time. When we get together with cousins, large family gatherings and everything, given both families, I was kind of an oddball. So in retrospect, yeah, there were aspects of me that just didn't fit in there. So many people will focus on primarily physical features, which I described. But in addition, there's just also personality characteristics. And I think as time has gone on, we've learned more and more about how those genetic bundles of where we came from really drive a lot of our personality traits, maybe some of our interests, some of our drives. So those things, as I got older and continued to grow in that family setting, I would say those things became more apparent too. I was a little outside the mold of what that family produced.
Can you look back and identify that maybe you had some trauma that could have been related to you being adopted when you were younger?
That is an interesting question. I've known that I've been adopted for about 24 years now, going on 24 years. And quite honestly, I've gone through counseling. I've, tried different ways to make sense of it and understand it. And as I've become more aware of who I am as a person, because before I found out I was adopted, the last place you would have ever caught me is in a counseling house. I just wouldn't have gone there. That just wasn't in what I saw as part of, quote, a normal person's life. And if anything, I would have avoided it. Now, you could start to ask, were you at some level aware? And that was, a scary thing to you. And I've come to believe that probably at some level I was aware. I don't know what level that was. And as I've become more familiar with the landscape of what the adoptee community looks like, whereas initially when I found out I was adopted, because I was a late discovery adoptee, I think I myself outside the class of the normal adoptee. But as time went on, I started to realize that actually there's a lot of my personality traits, and I'm going to say quirks, that I have in common with many adoptees. And some of that has to do with maybe some, I'll say, attachment, relationship issues. I did eventually come to terms with a problem that I had, which was a substance abuse and addiction problem. When you look at the adoptee population as a whole, I think it's 4 times of a greater likelihood that they're going to run into some of those problems as they go through life. So there's many attributes. And as I've connected with the adoptee community, it's like finally I'm finding a group of people I feel I belong to. Because I think so much of my life coming up to that point, I felt like I came from outer space. I knew something was wrong. Truth be known, shortly before that episode, we had recently moved back to southeastern Wisconsin to be around family. We were up in my wife and my 3 kids. All 3 of my children were born up in Minnesota, around the Twin Cities, and I really wanted to get back there. I had like a drive to get back to southeastern Wisconsin, and we had moved. We had settled. I was taking a late night walk right by Lake Michigan, and as I was walking, this was actually about a week before. Actually, it was the weekend of, but earlier in that week, I literally had a breakdown on the beach just because I realized, something was wrong. There was a misplace. And I think it was kind of an inner soul cry for help of like, show me what's wrong. Show me what is not fitting, because I could see that. And then boom, all of a sudden that happened. And that's why I say there was a lot that didn't make sense, but there was a lot that suddenly did make sense. It was like, oh, suddenly the pieces of the puzzle started to fit a lot better than they had up to that point.
So when you found out, there really wasn't anything like Facebook to connect with other adoptees. Were you able to find support anywhere?
That was interesting, and you're right. That was the year 2000, and you go back to 2000, internet was not what it is today. Facebook, really, I don't even know if it existed at that point. Maybe it did, but it certainly wasn't in the form it is today. What I did do is I started doing, internet searches, and the first thing I found was the organization, what is it, bastards.org, and which was an early, I'll say they started out, there was a lot of angry adoptees who were fighting to change laws. And that was a website. Through that website, I found another group, and it was actually a email kind of group chat that was for late discovery adoptees. It was run by a guy named Ron Morgan. I think he was out of the West Coast somewhere. And that became my lifeline, because that was the only group that I could find. Even when I did like literature searches trying to find, information about late discovery adoptees, there really wasn't anything out. There was nothing. I mean, I think I found a couple of passages in books about adoption, and basically they summarize that, anybody that's subjected to this horrible affliction is doomed from the start. It was not encouraging.
Yeah.
So that group actually helped me a lot, and that became my sounding board. I'd say for the better part of the next 3 or 4 years as I tried to kind of navigate and find my way through, who I am. A complete re-identification of trying to figure out who am I. That's really what it was about.
So once you knew that you were adopted and you got over the shock of the whole thing, did you feel like you were ready to go right out and find out where you came from?
Yeah, interestingly enough, I had a discussion with somebody yesterday, and it was a great discussion. And that was one of the things that I had found different about myself versus other adoptees. And as I talk to other late discovery adoptees, I think they're more in alignment as a whole with where I'm at, which is there was no second thought about I need to find out where I came from. I look at, most adoptees, and I think the terms and language that we use as we talk about adoption and people, I'll say, coming to terms at some point in their life, starting to identify where they came from and what that means in their life. And maybe are there connections out there that I have to biological family that, maybe I need to help me fulfill myself to understand the totality of who I am. When we refer to coming out of the fog, I think that's the most common term I've heard. It's interesting because a lot of adoptees, there's a certain amount that I think when they're young, they become interested at an early age. But for so many, it seems like there's, and this is just what I put together. This isn't based on a statistical study or anything, but, either there tends to be a life event. Either their adopted parents pass away,
Mhm.
and that often leads to that kind of revelation of, okay, now what? Or they start to have their own children, and that suddenly clicks a bulb within them that, they have a bigger question. There's other circumstances too that might lead to that. But in many cases, those are, as I've talked to the general adopted population, a lot of them, center around those two things. With myself, the moment, I should say within hours after finding out, in my head, the natural next question was, okay, where did I come from then? I obviously didn't come from where I thought I came from, and what's that backstory? Where is that? Who is that? Who is that person and how did they come about?
Mhm.
And that's what I often refer to as the second swing of the wrecking ball, because I found out I believe it was a Saturday, and then that Monday, that following Monday, I didn't understand the landscape I had been dumped into, so I called the county asking about, my birth certificate. And they just stumbled on their words, basically said, no, in your case, you've got to call the state of Wisconsin and talk to the Department of Family and Children Services. I called them, and in a very naive, stupid manner, I'm like, okay, first of all, just please confirm, am I adopted? Or have all these people gone nuts? Keep in mind, my parents had already passed away. And I thought, like, is this like some cruel, sick joke? I don't get what's going on here. And then when they confirmed I was adopted, well, to me, the next natural thing is, well, where did I come from? Who was I born to? And it became such a shock. But I'll tell you, the state social worker spent the better part of an hour educating me in terms of who I am, that I don't have a right to those records, that society has decided that there's laws that prohibit me from finding out who I am because I really didn't understand why. Why is that? Well, okay, well, they're trying to protect the birth mother from what?
Yeah.
Like, I'm going to go do what to her? I'm just trying to find out who I am. And so it was a harsh, wake up to reality. And that was the other part of the discussion I had with this guy yesterday. That it's interesting because when I look at the adopted population as a whole, those that are not late discovery, everybody spends the first 18 years of their lives basically being told, don't worry about that. It doesn't matter.
Mhm.
That's not part of what you need to worry about. When you become an adult, if you want to find out, go ahead. Now, today, what's good is I think there's been a case for more open adoptions, and a lot of people are starting to come through a more open system, which I think, from my viewpoint, is a lot healthier. It starts, and I use the word starts, it starts to remove part of the shame out of the lives of the adoptees, which
Yeah.
I think is what needs to happen.
So what did the process look like for you to find out anything about your adoption?
When I talked to that social service worker, that caseworker originally, she explained to me that it needed to start with an application and money, that I needed to fill out the application at the state, send them money. They would in turn then begin a search to locate my birth records. Once they found my birth records, they would complete, basically, I think they called it an analysis and revision of the records. An analysis? What does that mean?
Right.
Well, it means we're going to read through your entire record, and then we'll take a black magic marker and we'll learn everything about you. But at the same time, we're going to make sure you can't figure out who you are. And I'm like, you're going to do what? And once we get that done, we'll send you a copy of that. Then you'll become eligible to write a letter to your birth mother. And in that letter, you can explain to her in so many words, who you are and why you want to find out who you are. Then you'll turn that letter over to us. We'll call her on the phone, explain to her, that you've reached out and that you're interested in finding out who you are, and explain to her her rights. She has a right to decline the offer. If she declines it, I need to wait 5 years. I can attempt a second letter. If she declines that second letter, it's terminal. I'm not allowed to pursue my identity. And again, I wasn't trained on how to be an adoptee.
Right.
I didn't learn that growing up. I was like, well, I pay taxes. What are you telling me? My records are different.
Hmm.
Why can't I just look at my freaking record? It's right
Right.
there. You've got it. Why do you have, the reason I'm paying all this money is because I'm tying up the time of a social worker to read through this whole thing, blacking out my whole file. Well, don't do it. Just give me the file. It's my file.
Yeah. The 5-year wait's kind of weird too.
Yeah, that was harsh, and I'll say, because of how it happened to me, and they recognized that I was an outlier in their system, and they did expedite my file, so things moved a little more quickly than they normally would have. Because initially, she told me it'll be between 6 weeks and 6 months before I hear anything back,
Hmm.
and I'm like, so I'm just supposed, and I kid you not, when I found out in that moment, up till point when I actually talked to my original birth mother, it felt like I had nothing below my feet. And the only way to say it is, it felt like I was in a free fall. It didn't feel like I was going to die. It didn't feel like I was going to fall to the ground and hurt myself, but it felt like there was nothing below my feet, like I was walking on air. It was crazy. And, in my head, when she's telling me 6 weeks to 6 months, I'm like, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. That's a long
And
time.
I was determined not to let that. I actually went out, and I have a book out. I wrote a memoir. You can find out about, if you look at my name, Fred Nicora. It's www.frednicora.com. You can get to my website. My website's got a lot of good adoptee information. It's a great resource place too. So if you go under the resource tab, there's links to all kinds of really good stuff to help people find out about adoption, about late discovery adoption, and all that. But in the book, I do describe that, when the state said, like, they weren't going to do it, I was, I'm going to say, a pretty accomplished person. I had resources, that I was capable of doing things. So I started going at it, and I actually came and found a woman that was in the same graduating class as my birth mother, was a very good friend of hers, but I pinned her as my birth mother and then made some bad assumptions from there. Actually identified another woman that I thought was my half sister, through who I assumed would have been the father based on what I could find out about that wrong woman. She was convinced too. She thought I was her half. She was
Hmm.
bummed out when I eventually called her and said, no, I finally got the right information and I was off. Sorry, we're not related.
Hmm.
We just happen to look a lot alike. So it's interesting.
Yeah.
And I hear a lot of stories of how, I'll say, adoptees try to find out who they are, regardless of what the system lets them do.
So you were like not waiting around. You were going out there trying to find who these people were on your own. But how did
Yep,
you eventually find them? Did she accept the letter that you had written?
she did. She did.
Okay.
And that took, I think it was probably about 4 weeks. And, from the time it started till the time that, we actually connected. And we were in a reunion about 7 years prior to her death. And I'd say we both did as good as we could in the reunion. I'm sure you've talked to other people, and a lot of people have good in the reunion. They're challenging. I think TV and everything else has made them to be out something that, all of a sudden you meet these people, and my God, the bells ring, the gongs clang, and all your problems in the world are solved, and everything
Right.
just goes wonderful after that. And that typically is not the case from what I've put together and from what I've seen. More often than not, I'm coming into the relationship. Given my story's a little weird, but I think any adoptee, we've been rejected once. There's concern, there's fear, there's uncertainty. There's a birth mother then, depending on when you were born. In my case, I was born in 1959, conceived in 58. My birth mother went through hell. I'm going to say from her family, from society. She was a shameful creature. She had to hide behind a couch if people came to the door. When she started showing too much, she was shipped off to a big city to go live in, a work wage home where she was a nanny until she gave birth. And then after that, she was carted back to her house, told never to ever talk about this again, and pretend the whole thing was just a bad dream. She had a hard time, even when we did connect. I'd say within the first 5 sentences was, if you would have popped up 5 years earlier when my husband was alive, I would not have allowed this to happen. There was no way he could ever find out. And I'm scared to death today that his family is going to find out. So the number one condition here is, as you promised in your letter, you will hold this in your tightest confidentiality, and you will not let anybody know that you are my child. That has to be rule number one. And so even in the book that I wrote, she's masked. Her name is masked. The town is masked. I think you'd have a hard time figuring out who she is just through what's in the book.
Did you ever get to meet her in person, or was that part of the
No,
terms?
person. I mean, the other thing, and it was kind of interesting, as I was talking to the social services caseworker, I tried pressing her, give me help, give me clues. What's going to make this a successful letter? What's not? And she told me, she said, your letter's a very small part of it. She's got her own life that she's got to navigate given this. And it just depends where she's at. If she's lied about this, if she's never told anybody she had another kid out of wedlock, you're facing an uphill battle here, because she's scared to death probably.
Yeah.
I'm like, so you're telling me because she lied, I pay the price. I had nothing to do with it. Why am I the one I have a restraining order put on me from birth? Why? The social worker said, tell her she's got grandkids, but don't tell her too much about them. That's going to be something that's going to be a draw. And I'm like, so you're telling me my kids are bait? And she was funny. She said, I don't know if I'd use the word bait, but I guess you could say it in a way.
Yeah.
And so I followed her advice. And, she was right. She had one other grandchild through my half sister, who I eventually met. She had a total of 3 kids. One of them died at the age of 20. Another one died when he was in his 40s. I'm very fortunate. I mean, I'll say that. She had a genetic condition that manifested itself a little later in life. 2 of her kids got it, 2 of them didn't. I was one of them that didn't. That would have had significant repercussions on my life had I had that, especially if I didn't know I had it, and I did. My parents wouldn't have known that I had it, until later in life. I know everybody clings on to the medical stuff. And that seems to be where adoptees will get the sympathy cards. Like, well, yeah, I guess you should know your story. And a side tangent story. So my father, the father that raised me, and I had good parents. I was placed in a good home. I appreciate and love my parents, and I wish I could have brought to resolution with them after I found out I was adopted, because it would have been hard at first. I went through an angry phase. But once I got past that, once the dust cleared, I learned to appreciate them at a whole different level, too. I think looking back on it, that it was a hard decision they made, and it was hard on them, too. And that it was something that didn't allow for, I'm going to say, the fullness of where the relationship should have gone. Instead, it was a very contrived relationship. It had to be by the nature of what was going on.
Do you think you would have pursued finding your birth family had you known when your adoptive parents were still alive?
You know, there are so many what ifs.
Yeah.
I think I would have been more like the typical adoptee, that maybe it would have been when my parents died. Maybe it would have been when I started having children. Maybe I would have been curious earlier on. I don't know. I can look back and say, believe it or not, growing up probably would have been easier for me had I known. And I'm just going to say that from the standpoint that I struggled with not knowing what was wrong. You know, if you're adopted and you're aware that you're adopted and you see these incongruencies in between yourself and your birth family, between yourself and what's going on around you, at least you have something to hang that on. You understand that it's not just messed up wiring inside you. And I'd say that was, as a kid, when you know something's wrong, you're frankly, kids are narcissistic. They're self-centered. They are what they are. You just assume the problem orients from you. You're the wrong broken thing. And I grew up with that, and I think a lot of adoptees have that sense, but they also have the understanding that, well, I'm adopted and I don't belong here. So these differences I'm seeing, there's a reason for them. And it's not because I'm broken. It's because I came from a different place.
So have you been able to gain some understanding about why they didn't tell you, and were you able to forgive them for that?
Yeah, what I did right away, I did go through, I'm going to say a drilling period where I tried to get anything out of relatives I could. My dad's sister was alive, and I talked to her actually very soon after I discovered. And she was very open, very honest. I'm going to say I had a wide array of responses from adoptive family. Some saying that, how dare you go look? How dare you disgrace your mother and father this way? It was their choice to not let you know. How can you, pursue this? That was one extreme. The other was, we're sorry. We didn't necessarily agree with them, but at the same time, that was my sister. That was my brother. I mean,
Mhm.
and I got it. I understood. And what my aunt explained to me was that when her parents divorced in the 1930s, there were 5 children. There were 4 boys, and she was the oldest. And the kids were all just left with their mother. Divorce isn't like it is today. Basically back then, divorce, dad disappears, mom's stuck with 5 kids. There's no social net to hold everything in place. This was during the Depression, when they put some of those social nets in place, all the boys ended up in the county home, the orphanage. And she said what her brother had told her was that, and that was my father, that he just didn't want me growing up with that baggage, that he didn't want me to have to view myself from the eyes of being an abandoned child, being an adopted person.
Yeah.
Okay, I still don't necessarily know if I agree with his decision, but at the same time, I have compassion for his decision. I can empathize with it. And I've had my own kids. That's probably the biggest thing that I've come to realize is, having my own children who are now adults. I've got 30, 29, and 26. And you know, did I do things wrong as they were growing up? Oh, you better believe I did. And if I want to hold on to 1 ounce of hope that they'll forgive me, well, then I better lay that as an example of how I'm living my life.
Yeah, I mean, once you heard what the intent behind it was done in love.
Yeah. And is that the actual reason? I don't know. I
Hmm.
want to believe it is. And I'll even say, as you look at, I don't know how much reading you've done on it. Have you ever read or are you familiar with the book Primal Wound?
I have not read it. I've had some people tell me I should, and other people tell me not to bother. So I have not yet.
Well, brief context. Okay, it's written by a therapist who's also an adopted mother. It's challenging to read. I think the author brings out some really good points about what are some of the outcomes of the way adoption is handled and what happens as a result of adoption. I think her target audience really was adoptive parents. And so if an adoptee reads it, it becomes, I think, a little more challenging to read it and hold it at peace because it's not necessarily a pretty picture. I think there's good points in it, and there's some degrees that I would give it validation for what it is.
The whole time that you were in contact with your mother, were you a secret? Like she didn't tell anybody and you weren't allowed to tell anybody either?
You're talking about my birth mother, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we went through baby steps. I'll say that. And you got to keep in mind what I going into it, and I'm going to say that's where I think probably one of the biggest pitfalls for adoptees as a whole is they go into reunion with expectations. They can say they don't have expectations, but the reality is they're going to have expectations. I mean,
Yeah.
how can you not have an expectation? And those expectations, I'm going to say, are difficult to fulfill, you know? And so for myself, as soon as my birth mother came back and was like, well, my God, nobody can ever know that you exist, and you've got to keep this a secret. And whatever you do, you are not to keep anybody that I know, you know, ouch, there was another rejection, and it hurt. And it took me a while to process that and understand it. At the same time, I'll say when I showed up at her door, eventually, by her invitation, and I didn't just show up, it was her invitation. One of the first things she said when she looked at me is, oh my God, you look just like him. That line, keeping in mind how the relationships of the vast majority of adoptees' parents ended up, which isn't good, it's bad. It was hard on her. It was hard to do what she did. And again, I think she did the best she could. I give her a lot of credit for being a very graceful woman. But at the same time, I'm going to say, yeah, you know, it wasn't easy for me. You know, it wasn't easy for me either. It really was difficult. Eventually, she did agree that I could meet my half sister and then my half brother. And, you know, we had relationships. And I'll say those are difficult too. You know, it gets interesting when you start getting together. And I've been in reunion about 24 years now, 23-ish years. And there's very few that have really lasted a long. There's some that have gone better, and there's some that just really never went any. And some, you know, it's basically, okay, I see who you are. Awesome. Have a nice life, you know, and
Yeah.
that's about it. Well, what's weird is again, I think adoptees often go in with expectations and hopes, and those are difficult to fulfill. And it's crazy because you'll go in, you'll see somebody that basically has half your face. You know, it's like, what are you doing with that? You know, especially I didn't grow up with siblings. You know, I like, whoa, this I didn't look like anybody in my family. You know, and then all of a sudden it's kind of startling. But then at the same time, you have no history with them. There's nothing. You know, you're meeting for the first time, shaking hands, and you know, is there some strange electron exchange that occurs, and suddenly the atoms in your body go on high alert? I mean, I didn't feel it.
Yeah.
It's like, wow, well, that's interesting. Now, if you let some of those relationships, if you invest in them, and you let them grow, all of a sudden you start, you know, and you can even identify things right away, like, oh, you know, you like this, you like that, you enjoy this, and you know, how interesting. I'm a teacher. You're a teacher. You know, I mean, there are things that become apparent. They're easy. So it's easy, I'm going to say, to, you know, hopefully connect. But at the same time, I'm going to say there is no history. And you have to start from day one and work at it. And it takes work on both parts. And sometimes that happens, sometimes that doesn't.
So obviously, your biological mother knew exactly who your birth father was. Did she tell you who he was, or did you have to find that out on your own?
You know, I'm going to say, yes, she did tell me. And at the same time, I'm going to say, keep in mind, I'm coming from a place of distrust. You know, I was lied to about who I was. So now I meet another person, you know, she tells me who the birth father is. Well, there's a harsh reality for everybody. All our birth fathers are alleged birth fathers, you know, and then most of the time we grow up, we start seeing, do we look like him? Yep, I guess we look like him. I guess he's really my father. You know, mother, it's a little more irrefutable. You come right out of it, you know. So I generally believed, and I do look similar to him. So there was a lot to believe there, but I did do as time evolved, because even back when I found out, there wasn't Ancestry.com, there wasn't 23andMe, there were very rudimentary, fundamental systems that you could do genetic testing, and I did, but it really wouldn't tell you much, and I didn't have anybody else to go with. You know, there really wasn't any way to do it. So over time, eventually, I did find and connect with relatives that were on his side that showed me that he was my birth father. So I know with 100% certainty he is my birth father. I know she is, because you know I've done all the DNA testing.
So, were you able to connect with his family, and have you had any positive relationships come out of contacting his family?
Well, yeah, and first of all, he had passed away before I even found out I was adopted. So I never got to meet him. He had a total of 4 boys. I was so here's that got really crazy. So I started. I'll say I became obsessed with putting together the pieces of his life that I could. I think since I didn't get to meet him, that became almost an obsession, and I did. I met a lot of people in his family. Probably the most enduring relationship I've had out of all of the reunion relationships is with his half brother. I still talk to him on a fairly regular basis. He lives out in Idaho. I've seen him and met him a couple times. We have I'd say a healthy family based relationship. I also have 2 half brothers out of him. After he left my mother, well, it's a long story, but after they split, he eventually married. That didn't work out. He married again, had 2 boys. That didn't work out. And then he split from them. And I met those 2 boys. And one of them I kept in somewhat of contact over the years. That's faded out as of late. I really don't connect anymore. And then just about 3 years ago, I was on the ancestry.com database. And all of a sudden I got an email out of that database from a woman who I could see I had a very close relationship to, genetically, but didn't know who she was. And she started explaining that, we're first cousins in this database. She doesn't know who I am, but what she's trying to figure out is her father was adopted and he never pursued finding out his family. Well, I've been playing the databases long enough. I started looking at it, looking who she was related to, how close they were, who I was related to, what that relationship was. It turns out her father was my older half brother,
Oh,
and
wow.
he died. Yeah, I know. It was kind of a wow.
Yeah.
So she's my niece, but he died when he was 50, unfortunately. He had a bad heart condition. My father, my biological father, died at age 60 of a bad heart condition. I have my own little health issues right now. And that was, before we were talking about medical, related issues. And when my father died, he died of colon cancer. And I was in my late 20s when he got colon cancer. So as soon as we found that out, I started getting tested for colon cancer every couple of years because I was in a high risk place. Well, turns out there's no colon cancer in either of my family.
Hmm.
I had a lot of colonoscopies. I didn't really have. Should have been keeping an eye out for heart stuff. I wasn't. Now I am. Now I'm in a good place with trying to get that resolved. So
Yeah, that's a tough thing when it comes to health history because when they do actually give it to you, it's at a point where there may be nothing wrong with them. But as you said, like things develop in older adults, then you just have no
yeah,
idea unless you go back for like an update and they may not give you that.
yeah, and that's again, everybody kind of will kind of sympathize with the adoptee on the medical stuff, but I think what's really underrated is also the cultural and just that genetic mirroring, understanding. And I'll say some of the strongest healing moments I've had. It's crazy, but as I dove into the families, so I was raised by this set of parents who both of them, I'm going to say, were within 2 generations of coming off of both and just settling in the country. Well, it turns out biological dad's family, both sides, his mother and his father, came here in the late 1600s. Biological mom's family, her family, they're some of the first Norwegian settlers in Wisconsin. I mean, they were back in kind of the mid 1700s. So
Huh.
it's like these really old families. And as I discovered that, as I put all that together, and then as I started to really kind of generate my factual family tree of what that was comprised of, what it looked like, and who was there, and where everything was. And I've got actually just south of Milwaukee, I live in just north of the Milwaukee metro, and just south of it, which is where my biological mother was from, there's cemeteries down there with 3 generations of my great, 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 great grandparents. And to go there and stand on those graves and just realize that my relationship to those people is no different than anybody else's relationship to their great, great, great grandparents.
Yeah.
They died long before they were born, and mine died long before I was born. But yet, that's where I came from. That's where I sprouted, and that was, for me, that was very moving. It was a very moving moment just to understand that I still have that connection, regardless of what society did in the meantime.
Were you able to go see the graves? I know you had said that you were going to be in that area.
And I did. And actually, those I had seen already. I had gone down when I first found them. And that's why I say it was very moving. And then, yeah, as you mentioned, so I was just down at a farmer's market. I sell gluten-free breads and cookies. Farmers markets. I have my own business doing that, and I just had a market. It was right at that church. So I'm sitting there in this church, fellowship hall, looking out this window up this hill where my great grandparents are. It was interesting. I think I sold a lot of bread. And I think it was because I kept telling that story. Everybody was pretty humored by it.
Yeah, that's cool. So, why did you feel like you wanted to write the book?
It's been so interesting because I think initially like the seeking of the discovery, like we talked about before, where at some point it just hits you and it becomes more of a drive than
Mhm.
it does any conscious decision. And that's what happened to me. I actually wrote the vast majority of the book, and I'm going to say I had it 98% completed about 6 to 7 years after I discovered I was adopted. After that, sad but true, I went through a dark chapter. It's not covered in the book just because most of it was written before that. I came to terms with alcoholism. I'm going to say I did not have good coping tools in place going into my discovery. So by the time I started to internalize and understand it, I didn't deal with it well. And I eventually came to terms with I can't drink, I can't drug, I've got to stay away from that stuff because I need to figure out other ways that I can find peace within myself. And I'm just going to say it led to a lot of spiritual development. So,
Mhm.
which is good. And it's been a good path for me. And I've been sober 15 years now. So when I go back and look at that, the journey in its entirety is a little different than what the book is because the book was done, about 6 years after that. Now, after I sobered up, after I, put all that, did the work, put it behind me, psychologically, I got to the point where I could open myself up and put the book out there. I'm very revealing in the book. I'm very transparent. You understand what I'm thinking. So I did. I had it published about 3 years ago. And what I found is while it did what it was, I believe, supposed to do, which was a very cathartic process for me,
Mhm.
at the same time, it also provides a platform for me to talk about adoption issues, talk about records issues, talk about how do we change some of what we're trying to do. Because that has now become what I call my core mission. How do I contribute to the community to help better the community so those that come behind me don't stumble into the same holes that I stumble. So often I talk about if you're going to go do a reunion, make sure you're sober first, or make sure you understand what your relationship with drinking and drugs are, because that can be a pitfall. That can be difficult. And then also, I'm active in the state of Wisconsin trying to get the record laws changed. We just had a bill that came up, but it got slapped down again. But I'll start swinging again next year. So now it's actually that's the direction I've taken. When I go to farmers markets, I'm always talking about adoption. I'm always talking about records. I'm passing out my little slips. I'm writing a senator, your assembly person, telling them that you think the law should be open, that adoptees should have the same rights that everybody else has.
Yeah.
We're not asking for anything special. Just asking for what everybody else has, what I had before I found out I was adopted.
Yeah, Virginia had it going through their courts, and now they've decided that they're not going to entertain the idea, I guess, until next year. It's really disheartening when they can just put it off a year and people have been waiting for their entire lives.
Yeah, quite frankly, I mean, so my birth father, he died in 93. I discovered in 2000. So I missed him by 7 years. Obviously, my story's kind of weird. I didn't find out till I was 40. Had I looked earlier, I might have met him. That might have answered a lot of questions. It might have, kind of made things a little easier to navigate. And even if he would have rejected me, it would have explained a lot. My grandmother, his mother, actually died a month before I discovered. And then I found out who she was about a year after. It took me a
Hmm.
while to get traced death records and all that stuff. And that's what I think people don't understand. People die.
Right.
First
Yeah.
people change their minds, they die.
Yep.
It's like this isn't something. If we wait another year, it's going to be the same information. It's not. You don't know who you're not going to find. You don't know what you're not. I don't know if I'm going to have some genetic condition pop up in the next year that if I would have known about it earlier, maybe I'd live. Maybe I won't live now. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot
Exactly.
riding on it, and yeah, obviously I have my own feelings on it. It's just not right. It's
Yeah.
just not right. One of the things I mention to people is it's interesting when you look at our society, we've got a lot of disenfranchised people, a lot of groups of people that have different attributes that, for one reason or another, they've been discriminated upon in our society. And we've written laws, and I'll be the first to say the laws don't necessarily prevent the discrimination, but at the same time, at least we've come through and made a statement about we will not discriminate these people based on this attribute of who they are. As far as I know, adoptees are the only people in our society where we actually write laws that says we will discriminate based on this population based on their birth status.
Yeah. That's a good point. Do you have any events planned, either for your book or anything that you've been working towards?
Yeah, currently there's a couple of things that are going on. I'm scheduled it's late April, mid to late April. There's two groups that get together. It's a great conference, and if anybody's interested, I suggest you try and figure out if you can make it. It's out in Denver this year. It's National Association of Adoptees and Parents. NAP is a pretty good group. Just NAAP or type in National Association and Parents. You can find the group real easy. They're doing a joint conference with the group called Right to Know. And Right to Know is a fascinating group because that group has kind of piggybacked onto the adoptees. And it's an exploding group. And what they basically deal with, the vast majority of their population, are genetic surprises. So they're the people that are going on to 23andMe, and all of a sudden they find out daddy's not daddy.
Yeah.
Mommy's not mommy. How the heck did this happen? And so I'm kind of like the intersection between the two groups. I'm an adoptee, but I didn't know at birth, and I had a genetic surprise later in life. And so I'm actually featured on a panel at that conference coming up this year. It's called Untangling Our Roots. I think you can just go on untanglingourroots.org and you'll find that organization. The other thing I'm diving deep into, I don't know if it's going to go anywhere, but like the book, so last year, after I had the book published, I got contacted by a group, and the group thought, just based on how I presented the storyline of the book, it would make for a really good film. So they wanted me to engage with them, but they wanted cash. So I don't even know if it was a scam. Maybe it was a scam to actually have it turned into a script so that it could be made into a movie. Well, right at that point is when the screenwriters all went on strike and the whole thing just kind of disintegrated. Well, then I started just kind of diving into it for myself, and I thought, well, I wrote a book. Maybe I can do screenwriting. And so I've been kind of chiseling away at that, trying different storylines, and actually there's some competitions I've been entering, and some of my work is starting to kind of float up in the rank. So I'm hoping at some point maybe I can, end up with something that ends up on a screen somewhere somehow. We'll see. Time will tell.
Yeah.
Either way, the goal is to get that dialogue going. The more we can get people to understand the totality of what the factual adoption story is, as opposed to that narrative everybody's just been playing along with, I think the sooner we can get some of those records changed or record laws changed and maybe positively impact the process so people have a healthier adoption process going through it.
Yeah, that would be really interesting if you could get something like that going, because if there is a movie or a show that has adoption in it, which there aren't even many of those, it's always like that Hallmark Lifetime ending,
Yeah,
everything's
yeah,
great. So it'd be cool to see one that's like real.
yeah. That it's interesting because I've been. It's funny as you look at it. Okay, anybody that's going to do a movie is going to want to make money off it. Nobody's going to want to make a movie that nobody's going to watch.
Right.
So where do you go? Part of it becomes like, what can I put in the movie? Because if you put a movie out there that's just a downer with dead end, nobody's going to watch it.
Right.
And what good did it do anyway?
Yeah.
So it's like, how do you find that medium of being able to infuse, get people to go like, oh, I never thought of it that way, or, huh, interesting.
Yeah.
They have a point there. As I've done it, I've done a couple of scripts that I've been working on and looking at different degrees of how much can you infuse of reality into the Hallmark narrative.
Right.
What can you make it so that it's valid, but at the same time, somebody be interested in taking it somewhere? I don't know. I'm still trying to figure that out.
So I really just have one more question. And you talked about a little bit not going into reunion with any kind of substance abuse issues, trying to, get that taken care of before. But was there any other advice that you would give somebody who's entering into the journey of reunion?
I would say, take it at your own pace and let your heart be the guide. I think it's easy for adoptees to jump into it and start to go down that path. And, suddenly they find there's other people involved and they have their own agendas, at the same time. And as an adoptee, I think there's such a strong hunger to try and find it that we're not always willing to set up appropriate boundaries and make sure that taking care of ourselves as we go through the process. And if we need a pause, maybe don't be afraid to ask for a pause. Just be honest and open. Hey, I'm getting a little overwhelmed. Can we just get back to each other in a month or so? Something like that. The other thing I would say is don't be afraid to reach out to a counselor, and maybe establish a relationship before you go into it. Just so if things do get kind of rough, if they don't turn out quite the way that you had hoped they would turn out, that you have somebody that can maybe offer some professional advice in terms of what they're seeing, how you react to it, and help you just understand your own self better and what might be going on with you so that you can better cope with it.
That's great advice. Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you.
Thank you. I appreciate the chance to actually talk about my story and talk about where I'm at and talk a little bit about my book. People are interested in checking it out. Again, my website's Fred Nicora, FredNicora.com. You can just go there. It has links. You can get it on Amazon. It's called Forbidden Roots. You can also get it through Barnes & Noble. It's also available on Audible. If you're a listener, you can listen to it too.
If you have experienced an adoption reunion and would like to speak about it, please contact me at whathappensadafterpodcast@gmail.com. Also, check out the show's Instagram to see pictures of my guests. Listen next time to find out what happens after. Thanks for listening.